Rightio viewer, welcome back to the shed. Today we're doing a bit of work on the Harley. So this is a 2010 Softail Custom. It is the model pretty much the same through 2007 to 2010, and it has the 200 wide rear wheel. Today I'm going to be doing the rear wheel bearings, because they were installed wrong by the last shop. He didn't know about the Harley procedure for not side loading these bearings, because the inner tube that separates the bearings is longer than the hub. So it's a different setup to a normal bike standard arrangement for the rear wheel bearings. And to make things even more interesting, the brake caliper itself is mounted inside the dimensions of the wheel, so you have to remove the caliper to get that out. So just a quick overview of that. This model, if this looks the same as your bike, you'll have a 12.25-inch head here that you'll need a socket for. Make sure you use a 12 point, because if you don't, you will destroy it and that'll get stuck in there and it'll be a huge pain. So to remove the caliper, got to remove the pads. To get to this, we need to deal with the caliper bolts. So there are Torx. So you completely remove this one, but just loosen this one, because we're just going to want to pivot on that for a minute. So if I just loosen this one, now I can rock the whole caliper forward and get to that 12 pointer. So I can chuck my socket onto that and pull that one out. Those of you at the top of the class may have already realised I've pulled my pads out already. Just put that back in to show you. So I'll just roll that forward, and with no free hands, pull that one out. So once that's like that, then you can just pick up the top of your brake pads and pull them out. That's no dramas. Cool. Once you've done that, then you can completely screw out this front bolt. No, I'm going to have to get a tool for that. It's a little bit bound up. And pull that puppy out. We'll put that up there and have a good look at this one for wear. You can see mine's got a bit of wear in spots. It's too bad. Good new one. So then we can pull the caliper out. So I'll do that off camera so I can support the weight of the caliper, hang it off a cable tie, so it's not damaging my brake line. And then we can go to the next step. Alright, so next step, take off the belt guard. It's only 2.5 inches there. And then we'll take off the debris guard as well. Take that off because some people just pull it out of the way, but you're going to break it one day. There's a couple of narrow spots there. So you just pop the acorn bolt off the nut, sorry. Inside here is a little 1/2 inch bolt. You can just loosen that. This debris guard is slotted, so it'll fit over it. So just back that off and lift it up, and it'll get all that out of the way. And it'll make it so much easier. And just a little tip here, this is just a plastic nut set in there, so when you do fit this back on, don't go crazy tightening that up. You'll just pull it out of the plastic or spin it in the plastic and headache. And here's that slot in the front, so just back that nut off on the frame, the bolt, sorry, and lift it up. This will just pop straight out. And another tip too is the shockies on these, the shock absorbers under the frame, actually hang lower than the frame rails. So just prop up, I've got a little bit of conveyor rubber there, just on the frame rails, so you're picking up on the frame rails. If you don't, you'll end up picking up, actually taking all the weight on the shock absorbers. So that's obviously not good for it. So anyway, something for you to look at. So when you've got the caliper out, I've gone ahead and pushed my pistons back in, but you can see there's some shit on there. So go ahead and clean all that up. You'll have to push these all the way back flush with the caliper so you can fit your new pads in, and get all that crud out. So as you can see too, I've supported the rear wheel, got my trolley jack under there, just taking the weight, and you're ready to pull the axle out now. So I'll just sit down on my stool and do that. Alrighty, it's in position to take the axle out. So this floating part here is on a groove down there and will be held by the axle here. That'll all come loose when you pull the axle out and the wheel. It'll sort of have to travel with the wheel a bit to get off this slot. But your spacers, so obviously I've got my narrow one here, that'll just fall out. And on this side we've got a much larger spacer, that'll just fall out as well unless you can capture it. So you can see I've still got the belt on. Once I pull the axle out, the adjustment bolts ride on your spacers. There's actually there's not a second one on that side, but on the brake side there's actually a little collar inside there. That'll of course fall out. That fits inside a grooved section in the back of the frame there, so it gets located by that. So anyway, it's a bit of a two-handed job rather, to get that out, so without losing everything. So I'll just put the phone down and I'll pull that wheel out, the axle out rather, and catch all the gear, and we'll go from there. Right, yeah, so I just sort of jiggled and lowered the rear wheel just so I can get this smaller spacer out. Then I jumped over the other side and pulled the bigger spacer out. Careful not to get any anti-seize or anything crazy on the belt. And then now the wheel can come out. But this brake mount, of course, because it's trapped between the rotor here and on this slot, will sort of need to come out with the wheel. So you can sort of cradle that and don't bash on it. You'll score your rim and eventually it'll all slide out. It's all okay, and then you've got that internal collar there that the adjuster bolt sits on. I did actually have to back off this adjuster a little bit to get my belt off. It was adjusted up fairly snug, but anyway, if you have to do that, pop that belt off and then you can pull the wheel. Right, so I'll just finish getting this wheel out. Right, yeah, so wheel out, no dramas, apart from the usual. Right, so what you can see here is the bearing that's been installed. So you'll be able to use this as a guide. I'll just grab a ruler. Now, I don't know how well you can see that, but I can see that bearing is inside 1, 2, just short of 3 mil. That's been put in where a bike shop, non-Harley Davidson bike shop, put it in, and then replicated by the next place. So what I noticed though, when it was out, because I was able to see it, is there's a gap between this bearing, other side, and the shoulder. And I assume that's because the bike shop doing the install, see it's up against the spacer there, the spacer tube inside. The bike shop doing the install doesn't know the Harley procedure for putting it in, and they try to centre the bearings, so they've probably realised when they've gone to put the bike back together, if you don't have these bearings in the right spot, the rotor, when this part's in, the brake disc rotor won't line up in its groove properly. It'll be off to the side, and you can see where mine's hit and actually been rubbing on the edge of that mount, you know. So they've probably gone, shit, that's not right. Wheel off again, press the bearings again to move that rotor over, because at the moment, I can guarantee you, neither bearing is shouldered. It's been put in, pressed in, up against the other bearing, and they both are touching that spacer pipe inside. The spacer pipe is longer than the distance between the two shoulders because of the special Harley procedure, apparently. And that's not how it's been done. And so anyway, so if you're looking at yours, because you'll be able to see this while it's on the bike, your bearing, if it's flush here, or this depth or shallower, it's not been installed properly. I think Harley shops will be all over it, and probably most shops are, but certainly the ones that I used became popular and they started employing young fellas, probably don't know much about Harleys, and they start just guessing and doing it the way they want to do it on their dirt bikes or other street bikes. Anyway, there have been a lot of bearing failures, a lot of them with this particular model, because people aren't doing the bearings properly, and of course the bearings are getting cheap. The problem is though, is when and going back to non-Harley shops, we don't have a Harley shop for miles and miles around here, like hundreds of kilometres, so you end up at other shops. For those that are wondering why I'm not going to a Harley shop, I do a lot of stuff myself, but usually I get new bearings when I get new tyres. And I've had to, because the bearings have been fucked. But anyway, surprise, surprise. But anyway, when they install this wheel and they realise, oh, the rotor isn't travelling in the right bloody position on that mount bracket, they just press these thinking, oh, the wheel needs to come over more. But if you press this bearing now, you're side loading the bearing, because it's friction locked interference fit at the top there, or the outer circumference. It's up against the spacer tube in the middle. So wherever you put force, unless you've got a special dual lipped tool, you're going to side load this bearing, and you're also going to side load the other bearing, and you can't avoid that. If you're pushing this bearing, it's pushing on the spacer tube, and it's pushing on the other bearing. So basically you've buggered the bearings trying to install them brand new on a customer's bike, because Harley's got a special way of doing it with these 200 tyres. So in the manual, it basically says that you install the primary side, and they call it the primary brake side, first, all the way, shouldered. So this bearing here on this side, because I've got a single brake, this is the primary brake side. It's got nothing to do, when in the manual when it says primary, it's got nothing to do with the primary drive side. This is the primary brake side, and that's what counts when it comes to bearings. So install this bearing up against its shoulder. Then, when it comes time to installing this bearing, you just gently send it in until it's touching the tube, the spacer tube in between. You should still be able to wiggle it a little, that spacer tube. You might not get any side play, but you're just kissing that inner spacer tube, and that won't side load your bearing. So yes, this bearing on this belt drive side is sort of floating, but it's interference fit, and it stops the side loading of the bearings. That's basically the crux of the problems with the 200s. So anyway, I'll move on to the next step and we'll go from there. Rightio. So now I've got this bearing out, pulled it out with the old trusty puller. You can see where this bearing has been installed to, and you can see that really light corrosion, probably a good 3 or 4 mil there, before it would actually be shouldered. So when I install this, obviously that spacer tube will be removed now the way. This bearing will get sent all the way home to that shoulder. You can see there, neither side of this wheel has been shouldered with its bearings. So yeah, I guess you can't trust what the shops are doing. You've got to learn to do it yourself. Okay, and here you can see on the belt side, you can see more corrosion there, or markings, whatever you want to call it. It's obviously an indicator the bearing's not seated, but we know that that's okay on this side. Obviously probably not that big a gap, because the other bearing wasn't seated properly, but we'll do a measurement there so you can get some type of indication as well once we do this one. So anyway, I'll get these in, I'll give this a big clean up, and we'll get them in and we'll do some measurements. Alrighty, so I've installed the primary brake side bearing, and when I use my calipers to check that depth. I am at 4.7 millimeters. If you'll be able, there we go. And down there somewhere you'll be able to focus eventually. 4.7 millimeters deep. So if you can measure something, a little bit of tape or something, and cut it and fold it over, even when it's on the bike, you'll be able to reach down and get an indication anyway of whether this bearing is home. Might be not the case if you've been installing it yourself or had someone do it that's not aware of that procedure. All right, so let's do the other side. Righto, so you don't have to do this, but I thought I'd do it out of curiosity. I measured from the deck height of this pulley down to this spacer tube, and that was 37.4 millimeters. So the width of my bearing is 15 millimeters. So that means when I have my bearing in the right place, I should have 22.4 millimeters from the top of the bearing to the pulley surface there. Now, of course, you can't use this rule because, you know, you might do that and it'll bind up, it'll hit, you know, if you're not measuring properly or whatever variable there is, but it gives me an indication of how far I'm going. You know, you also want to make sure that this spacer tube is seated properly on the other bearing. It isn't hooked up somewhere or not sitting properly when you take your measurements or when you're sending it home. The best way to do this is your threaded rod puller that will insert that bearing nice and gradually using thread, and it'll so much better. I unfortunately don't have one of those, so I'll be using old-fashioned drift to the outer circumference of the bearing, and it'll be going very, very carefully. But yeah, it might be something I'm gonna need to invest in. Quick little story. I'd had this bike from new. It only had about probably 8,000 kilometers on it. I was just about to ride it from Cairns to Darwin. Massive ride, like for me it was at the time. It was 4,500 k's, something like that. Anyway, I was just about to leave, talked to a mate who works in a bike shop in Perth that I'd worked with before, and he said, "Oh, that model bike, change your rear wheel bearings, they'll be buggered." And I'm like, man, it's practically a brand new bike. Don't argue, go in and do it. When I dropped my bike off to get tyres, asked them to check the rear wheel bearings. They said, no way, they're fine, don't worry about it, it's a new bike, you're overthinking it. Told them, just do it please. When I turned up to pick the bike up, their jaws were on the ground, the bearing was rooted. So I was just about to ride this bike across Australia on my own to start a new job, and I would have had a catastrophic failure in the middle of nowhere. There's no services. Sometimes you can go for days without seeing a car. That's an exaggeration. And, you know, it would have been, I couldn't even imagine how that would have unfolded. So I was pretty grateful for old mate, bought him some beer. But that is a good example. That's from the factory. That was buggered like 8,000 k's. If I didn't know about this problem, I wouldn't have been changing my rear wheel bearings more frequently, like every time I have tyres changed. But of course now I realise maybe because A, they're probably crap bearings, but I don't want to start in that argument about Harley and their quality of bearings. I use, this time I've used All Balls bearings. That's them there. And I've just given up on trying to follow whether Harley have improved their bearings or not, so I'm not risking it. Everybody seems to trust All Balls, so I'll go with them. So anyway, short story. It's always been a problem from new, and there's probably people out there riding around on the same bearings that don't even know. They probably aren't doing big Ks either, but if you've got one of these bikes, it might be worth checking out. And as you can see here with such a large bearing, you can see right through it there into the spaces. So you're getting a fairly good indication as you go. So I'm obviously not measuring yet. I'm just moving my way in slightly and slowly, and I'll pull up in a sec. Be very careful that you're not tipping the bearing a little sideways as you're drifting at home. Some people, when they get to a certain point, think, oh, enough of the bearing is in, it'll be right, I'll just keep going. But these hubs are really soft and your bearings are really hard, so you will destroy your bearing journal on your hub. So keep checking for square before you keep proceeding. All right, I'll get down a bit further. Rightio, so I've just been taking that bearing in ever so gently. You can see there that it's just below that shoulder. I'll get you a better pointer here. So that shoulder is part of the machine, part of the hub. That there, I'll measure it, but it looks to be like a mil or something, just below it. Down there, it looks like there's still a gap to the spacer bar tube in the middle, but there's not. That's actually touching. I can get in there and just move it back and forward, so it's not crazy bound up on it, but it's just touching. I've got no side movement at all. So that, to me, is perfect. So I'll just measure that little shoulder. I mean, it's pretty bloody minor, but we'll do it anyway. Like exactly 1 millimetre. So 1 millimetre on the other side, and whatever the hell I said before on the other side. What did I say? 4.7 millimetres on the other side. I'll have to rewatch this video myself. Cool. So if you can ascertain those guesstimations standing beside your bike with a beer in your hand, you might actually have a clue whether your bearings have been installed properly or not. Anyway, the rest of the video is either in reverse to put it back on, or watch someone else's for the boring stuff. It's been done 1,000 times. Yeah, hope you might have picked something up from the video. Those of you who want to argue about proper Harley practices and all, whatever, I don't care. Just if you're still watching it, so you must have got something out of it. Hopefully someone doesn't crash because of their bearings now, and spread the word. All right, see yous.